Think about it. The world in 1750 versus today. Fewer kings, fewer empires, more people having a say, generally speaking.
Mm-hmm.
In this overall sense that everyone should, get a fair shot, that long-term trend toward equality since the late 18th century, it's pretty undeniable.
Yeah, the broad arc is there.
But I mean, you just have to look around, right? Whether it's a wealth gap or how different groups get treated or even just basic opportunities, we're clearly not there yet.
Not even close, in many respects.
These inequalities persist across so many different lines. Status, wealth, power, income, gender, where you're from.
Yeah.
You name it.
And they often overlap, piling up on the same groups of people.
Exactly. So for this deep dive, we've got a really fascinating stack of research here. And our mission really is to understand the historical forces that have pushed for more equality, but also, crucially, what lessons can we maybe pull out for the future?
Looking at the drivers, the struggles, the successes and failures.
Right. We're trying to see the big picture, acknowledging that inequality isn't just one thing, and, you really need to look beyond just one country or one academic field to get it.
Absolutely. That cross-border interdisciplinary view is vital.
And the sources we're digging into offer a really interesting, I'd almost say optimistic perspective on this. They suggest becoming well-informed doesn't have to leave you feeling totally overwhelmed by it all.
Which is good news. And they draw heavily on this new economic and social history, using international studies to get a truly global view of things like capitalism and industrial revolution.
Yeah, we'll be touching on thinkers like Ken Pomerantz and his work on the Great Divergence. So, yeah, buckle up. This is where we start seeing the real shape of things.
And what's really compelling about these sources is how they stress the interconnectedness. These different inequalities, status, property, power, income, gender, origin, they don't exist in silos. They influence each other. And like you said, it's not just one nation's story. This new history really emphasizes global connections. Pomerantz's Great Divergence, for instance. A key takeaway for you is that Western Europe's boom wasn't some kind of isolated miracle.
Right.
It was deeply tangled up with how global resources were used, often forcefully, and setting up this international division of labor that really benefited Europe. People like Partha Sarathi and Sven Becker have built on that, showing just how connected it all was.
So when we talk about this long-term trend toward equality, it's definitely not a simple, straight line up, is it? There are advances, sure, but limitations, struggles.
Absolutely. There is a clear long-term trend since the 18th century towards greater equality in many ways. But it's crucial, absolutely crucial to understand how it happened. It wasn't automatic. Not at all.
Yep.
It came from sustained struggles, massive social movements, and the slow, grinding transformation of our institutions, legal systems, social norms, fiscal structures, education, voting systems, everything. Understanding those mechanisms is key.
And it sounds like sometimes we make it harder for ourselves to learn this history. Like we forget things or we get stuck in our own national bubble.
Exactly. There's often this kind of historical amnesia. And focusing only on national stories, well, it really limits our understanding. Intellectual nationalism, seeing everything through just your own country's lens, it blinds you to the bigger global forces. And the way we often chop up knowledge into separate academic boxes, that doesn't help either. You really need to connect the dots across time and place.
You mentioned Ken Pomerantz and the Great Divergence. For someone just tuning in, what's the nutshell version there? What really shifted between Europe and, say, China?
Right. The Great Divergence, it refers to that key period, roughly 1750 to 1850, when Europe's economic path really started separating from major Asian powers like the Ottoman and Chinese empires.
Okay.
Pomerantz points to two big things. First, Europe was running out of easy energy from wood, basically deforestation. This scarcity, plus finding lots of accessible coal, especially in Britain, pushed innovation in new energy tech. Think steam power.
Right, the classic Industrial Revolution story.
But second, and this is really crucial insight for you listening, European states, because they were always competing fiercely with each other, got really good at raising money and projecting military power. Their fiscal and military capabilities ramped up significantly.
Okay.
And that allowed them to organize and profit from a global system of resource extraction and labor, often through colonialism and trade stacked in their favor.
So it wasn't just European cleverness happening in a vacuum.
Not at all. And later research really drives this home. Partha Sarathi looks at the global trade networks, how Europe positioned itself, And Sven Beckert, with the New History of Capitalism folks, they really highlight the absolutely central role of resource exploitation, often brutal colonial practices and slavery, in fueling Western industrial growth. It fundamentally changes how you see that whole period.
Beyond these big economic shifts, you also mentioned a renewed focus on people's history.
Hmm.
Why is that angle important for understanding equality?
Well, because the push towards equality doesn't just come from enlightened rulers or abstract ideas. It's driven by ordinary people, their actions, their demands, their resistance.
Hmm.
When you look at history from the bottom up, you see how vital popular struggles and social movements have been in challenging the status quo and pushing for a fairer society. Their story is integral to how change actually happens.
And a huge piece of understanding inequality is looking at wealth distribution through history, right? People have been thinking about this for ages.
Oh, absolutely, for centuries. Plato had ideas about wealth limits. Rousseau famously critiqued private property as the root of inequality. But systematically studying how wealth and income were actually spread out, that only really became possible with industrial capitalism and the first attempts to gather data.
Like wages, profits, that kind of thing.
Exactly. Wages, profits, land ownership. Marx was an early pioneer here, trying to use British financial data to understand capitalism's dynamics.
But I guess that early data must have been pretty patchy.
Oh, very much so. The 20th century was the real leap forward, with much more systematic data collection. Researchers started piecing together long-term series on prices, wages, land income, even inheritances. Ernest Labrousse, for example, showed a clear link between economic hardship and the unrest leading up to the French Revolution using this kind of data. And scholars started stressing how important it was to study income distribution now to understand the whole economic and social picture.
So with all this data becoming available, are we getting a much sharper picture of these long-term wealth and income trends?
Yes. Definitely. Thanks to a huge collective effort by many researchers, we now have historical data on income and wealth going back often to the 18th or 19th centuries. This lets us see the broad sweeps, the big changes.
Okay.
And there's also new research connecting these economic divides to social and political divisions, building on older work about how societies split along certain lines. But it's important to say, combining all these different data types and research methods, that's still ongoing. There's still a lot to learn.
Now, all these big shifts, this pushback against inequality, it doesn't happen in a void, does it? It's all happening within existing power structures, institutions. There's always pushback.
Precisely. You absolutely have to look at the constant back and forth between social struggles, the underlying power dynamics, and the political and institutional results. And that includes the role ideas and ideologies play in shaping all this.
Right.
If you ignore any piece, the struggles, the power, the institutions, the ideas, you get an incomplete, maybe even misleading picture. Think about the resistance to change today from, say, super wealthy transnational actors. It echoes the kind of resistance elites put up during the French Revolution. Overcoming that kind of entrenched power takes massive, sustained collective effort, often sparked by crises.
So we shouldn't just assume everyone will eventually agree on what fair looks like and things will sort themselves out.
Absolutely not. That idea of a spontaneous consensus on fair institutions, it's a dangerous illusion, really. Issues like the welfare state, progressive taxes, how to deal with historical injustices like colonialism or slavery, these are incredibly complex. They need more than just good intentions. They need historical knowledge, access to information, serious deliberation, and hearing lots of different viewpoints.
You mentioned the Soviet Union earlier. How does that fit in as an example of this power versus institutions dynamic?
Well, the Soviet case is a really stark cautionary tale. On one hand, the revolution tapped into massive popular anger about inequality. And early on, they did make some real gains in things like literacy and health.
Right.
You could even argue its existence pressured Western capitalist countries to adopt stronger welfare states. But the Bolsheviks' certainty that they had the only right answer led to crushing dissent, absolute power, and ultimately a totalitarian disaster. And then its collapse, leading to this kind of hyper-capitalism in Russia. It just underscores the dangers at both ends. Ignoring power dynamics is risky, but so is thinking you have the perfect institutional blueprint and imposing it. You need that balance. Acknowledging the power of struggles while also getting serious about building just democratic institutions through open debate.
That sounds like a very fine line to walk. Now, switching gears slightly, The sources also point to some pretty undeniable progress in basic things, like how long people live, getting an education.
Yes, definitely. When you look at some core indicators of human well-being, the progress since, say, 1800 is just staggering. Global life expectancy at birth, it went from maybe 26 years in 1820 to around 72 today.
Wow.
And infant mortality, it plunged from something like 20%, 1 in 5 babies not making it past their first year, to under 1% globally now. Even if you survive that first year, your expected lifespan has more than doubled. These are profound changes.
And alongside that, just the sheer number of people and average income. Huge increases there too, right?
That's correct. World population, maybe 600 million in the 18th century. Now over 7.5 billion, more than tenfold. And average global income, adjusting for prices, also up more than tenfold. But it's important to remember the really significant takeoff in average income didn't happen until the late 19th and especially the 20th century.
But that kind of growth, I mean, it puts a massive strain on the planet. We can't just look at population and income alone, can we?
Absolutely right. This huge expansion in people, production, income, it's come at a heavy cost. Overexploiting natural resources. We have to ask critically, is this sustainable?
Yeah.
And what institutional changes do we need to shift course? This means looking beyond simple measures like GDP, gross domestic product.
So GDP doesn't give us the full picture. What should we be looking at instead?
Well, GDP just measures the value of stuff produced within a country. A more useful measure, especially for sustainability and long-term well-being, is national income.
Okay, how's that different?
National income accounts for the depreciation of capital, including natural capital, our resources, and it tracks the net flow of income into and out of the country. So the key insight for you is just looking at production, GDP, can hide whether growth is sustainable or where the wealth is actually ending up.
Right.
But even national income isn't perfect, especially for the environment. Trying to put a price tag on, say, biodiversity loss, it kind of creates this illusion that you can always just pay to fix the damage.
So we need more than just economic numbers, a wider dashboard.
Precisely. We need a more balanced view of progress using a range of social and environmental indicators. Clear climate targets, biodiversity goals, specific objectives for cutting carbon emissions. Those are crucial.
Instead of just one number to rule them all.
Exactly. Rather than replacing GDP with another single magic number, which can be opaque, we should track multiple transparent indicators. Carbon emissions, income inequality, health access, education levels.
Makes sense.
And even for inequality, instead of complex indices like Gini coefficients, it's often much clearer to look at things like what share of income does the poorest 50% get versus the richest 10%. Much more intuitive.
Let's shift to property. It's not just about houses, is it? The sources seem to break it down differently.
That's right. To really grasp power dynamics, you need to look at different kinds of ownership. Setting aside the horror of slavery owning people, we can broadly categorize property into, say, 4 types.
Okay.
1, the means of production. That's land, factories, equipment, offices, financial capital, all that. 2, housing, where most people actually hold a lot of their wealth.
Right.
3, the state itself, which we kind of collectively own through taxes and public debt. And 4, ownership of the rest of the world, a nation's assets held abroad.
And how does that typically break down? Is one category way bigger than the others?
Well, in most developed economies today, housing often makes up about half the total value of private property held by individuals. The other half is mostly those means of production, business assets, financial assets, held directly or indirectly through stocks, bonds, banks. But, and this is key, those are just averages. They mask enormous inequality.
Yeah, I bet.
Like in France recently, average private property per adult was around 220,000 euro, roughly half housing, half business financial. But the reality is a tiny fraction of people own a huge chunk of that, especially the means of production.
And this idea of owning the state or owning the rest of the world, can you unpack those a bit? They sound more abstract.
Sure. Think of owning the state this way. Your taxes fund public services, infrastructure. That's a form of collective ownership, right? Public debt is also part of it, a claim on future public resources.
Okay.
Ownership of the rest of the world is just the net position. Assets your country's residents own abroad minus assets foreigners own in your country. For France today, that net figure might be near 0. But historically, especially during colonialism, owning assets overseas was a massive part of global power and inequality.
So zooming out again, the big historical trend is property getting more concentrated or less?
The very long-term trend, though it's been incredibly slow and full of reversals, does point towards some deconcentration of power and property compared to, say, feudal times. But it's slow,
Yeah.
very slow.
Let's circle back to that great divergence. You mentioned the two factors, energy and state power in Europe.
hmm
Can you flesh that out a bit more? How do they specifically let Europe pull ahead of the Ottoman or Chinese empires then?
Certainly. The shift to coal, it just provided a much more potent concentrated energy source than wood, crucial for the new industries. That gave Europe a production edge.
Right.
But just as important was how European states developed. That constant rivalry between them pushed innovation in raising taxes, building bureaucracies, fielding armies and navies. This let them mobilize resources and project power globally much more effectively than the large, more centralized, but perhaps less fiscally dynamic empires in Asia at that specific juncture.
And this rise of European power,
Right.
it's impossible to separate it from some really dark history, isn't it?
Yeah.
Slavery, colonialism.
Absolutely impossible. You have to talk about them together. European prosperity in that era was fundamentally linked to exploiting colonial resources and, critically, slave labor.
Can you give an example?
Think about British textiles. The whole system depended on cotton grown by enslaved people, first in the West Indies, then massively in the U.S. South, often financed by British capital, processed in British factories. Or sugar from slave plantations. By the 1830s, the amount of land effectively cultivated outside Britain to supply it with cotton, sugar, timber via plantations and colonies was enormous, maybe 1.5 to 2 times the entire arable land of the UK itself. It forces you to rethink the whole narrative of purely internal European progress.
Definitely paints a starker picture. And the fiscal strength you mentioned, how did that play in?
Between 1500 and 1850, European states got much better at collecting taxes relative to their economy size compared to the Ottoman or Chinese empires, whose tax receipts stayed relatively low and stable. More tax revenue meant bigger armies, navies, administration, which enabled further expansion and control of trade. Ironically, Europe's political fragmentation fueled wars, but that competition also drove state building and financial innovation that ultimately helped them dominate globally.
Sven Beckert's work on the Cotton Empire seems super relevant here.
It is hugely relevant. Beckert shows meticulously how slave labor was the absolute linchpin of the booming global textile industry in the 18th and 19th centuries, where Britain became dominant.
Right.
After the Haitian Revolution hit sugar production, the U.S. South ramped up cotton, fueled by a massive increase in the enslaved population. At the same time, Britain used its military and economic power, partly through the East India Company, to systematically dismantle India's thriving textile production, which had been a world leader.
Wow.
So you have slave cotton from the Americas, plus the deindustrialization of Asia. That combination was fundamental to Britain's industrial rise and the wider European economic surge. And you see China's and India's share of global manufacturing just plummet during the 19th century.
And it wasn't always about free markets driving this, was it? Countries used protectionism too.
No, absolutely not. Protectionism, using tariffs and barriers to shield your own industries, was standard practice for virtually every country that successfully industrialized. Europe, the US, Japan, Korea, Taiwan, later China. The pattern is often build up your industries behind protective walls, then advocate for free trade once you have the dominant position. Wallerstein's world systems theory helps explain this core periphery dynamic, where trade rules often benefit the powerful.
And to justify all the expansion and exploitation, the ideology shifted too.
Yes, absolutely. In the 19th century, you really see the rise of new justifications for colonialism, often based on ideas of racial superiority, a civilizing mission for Europeans. It was different from earlier religious justifications. Prominent writers and thinkers promoted these ideas, and they had a devastating, lasting impact. But it's also crucial to remember inequality itself is ancient, predating capitalism and the state. It's not inherently good or bad for equality. It depends entirely on who controls it and what they use it for.
This legacy of slavery and colonialism,
Huh.
it casts such a long shadow. We're still grappling with it today in debates about reparations.
Exactly. That debate is very much alive and central. And the argument that it's all too long ago, well, it doesn't really square with how we do address other historical injustices.
Like what?
Well, think about ongoing efforts to return property stolen from Jewish families during the Nazi era, or compensation paid much later, like to Japanese Americans interned during WWII in the U.S. These show societies can, and sometimes do, try to make amends for historical wrongs, even generations later.
The British abolition of slavery in 1833 often comes up, but they paid the slave owners, not the enslaved. That seems fundamentally wrong.
It was profoundly unjust. The British government paid a massive sum, £20 million, a huge amount then, to compensate slaveholders for losing their property.
Unbelievable.
Even many abolitionists at the time saw the injustice but felt it was a pragmatic, maybe necessary compromise to get abolition passed, given how deeply embedded property rights were. But the question lingers. Why compensate the perpetrators and not the victims of generations of forced labor and brutality? Some radical voices, like Condorcet or Paine earlier, did argue for compensating the enslaved, but the power lay with those who prioritize property above all else.
And we see the echoes today, right? Like the Black Lives Matter protests leading to statues coming down.
Absolutely. That anger, those protests removing statues of slave traders or people who profited from the system, it reflects a growing public reckoning with these legacies. In France, too, Christian Taubira proposed a committee back in 2001 to look into reparations for slavery, though it didn't get far. And in French overseas territories like Martinique or Guadeloupe, debates about land reform are still happening, because land ownership is often still skewed toward descendants of the white colonizers from the plantation era.
You mentioned the U.S. being founded as a slave-holding republic. That's a powerful framing.
It is, and it's accurate. Washington, Jefferson, many founders were slave owners. Slavery was deeply embedded in the Southern economy and society from the start, while the North developed differently, based more on free labor and, importantly, on the displacement of indigenous peoples. This fundamental conflict over slavery was there from day one.
If you compare the inequality in those slave societies to later colonial setups, what do you see? Similar patterns.
You see a spectrum of intensely unequal systems. While the absolute peak of wealth concentration might have been even higher in some slave societies, the basic mechanisms of discrimination and exploitation were common across many colonial contexts, think French Algeria or South Africa under apartheid. Even after slavery was formally abolished, colonial regimes used laws, taxes, education systems, social rules, everything to maintain racial hierarchies and keep wealth and power concentrated. Emmanuel Sada's work shows how French colonial law created specific legal statuses based on race that lasted well into the 20th century. And just look at education spending in colonies versus the colonizing country early last century, the difference was vast.
Even within Europe, getting rid of unfree labor was a slow process, wasn't it?
Oh, yes. Serfdom had mostly faded in France pre-revolution, but vestiges remained, and things like unpaid labor obligations, the corvées, were common. The revolution itself had big debates about whether to abolish those with compensation for landowners or without. And after the Industrial Revolution, the new working class faced incredibly harsh conditions. Laws like the Master and Servant Act in Britain basically criminalized breaking a work contract. But conditions in the colonies were even worse. Outright forced labor persisted in many places until after World War II.
But eventually, things did improve for workers in Europe through unions and political action.
Yes, gradually. Through decades of struggle, strikes, organizing, labor movements won major gains. Child labor laws, the right to unionize, workplace safety rules, collective bargaining, limits on hours, paid holidays, social security.
A welfare state starting to form.
Exactly. This led to the rise of the salaried society, where a regular wage became the norm. Though it's worth noting, some recent trends towards gig work and self-employment are challenging parts of that system again.
And this progress wasn't always even, right? Even within Europe.
Not at all. Look at Sweden, often seen as a bastion of equality now, but its voting system was weighted by wealth and income well into the 20th century. Rich people literally had more votes.
Wow, I didn't know that.
It took the rise of the Social Democrats to fundamentally change that. It just shows there's no inherently egalitarian culture. It comes down to political choices and power balances. And the institutions themselves, constitutions, electoral rules, they really matter. The French Senate, for example, has historically often been a conservative brake on reforms.
So sometimes you actually need to reform the political system itself to make progress on equality possible.
Precisely. Think about the fight in the UK to curb the power of the House of Lords early in the 20th century, or FDR threatening to pack the U.S. Supreme Court when it was blocking New Deal legislation.
Right.
Sometimes you have to challenge the institutional roadblocks. Law should be a tool for emancipation, not a barrier. Even how property rights are defined in a constitution matters. Germany emphasizes the social obligations of property more than France's definition, which affects things like implementing worker co-management.
Co-management.
Yeah.
That sounds like spreading power within companies.
Exactly. Ideas around participatory socialism, co-determination, like in Germany or Nordic countries, they aim to give employees a real say in running their workplaces.
How would that work?
Well, you could imagine systems where employee representatives hold substantial voting rights on company boards, maybe even up to 50%, especially in larger firms, perhaps with limits on how much voting power any single large shareholder can wield. The case for pure capital control is maybe stronger in tiny companies where the owner's personal risk is everything.
Is anyone actually proposing this now?
There's renewed interest. You see legislative proposals in the US and UK about worker representation on boards. The UK Labour Party's manifesto talked about economic democracy. And historically, of course, unions and collective bargaining were key tools for shifting power and reducing inequality. Remember, the mid-20th century saw a significant compression of inequality in many capitalist countries.
This great redistribution in the 20th century, what really drove it?
Public education was massive. Huge expansion across the West, leading towards universal secondary schooling. That was a powerful engine for mobility and growth.
Okay.
Extending voting rights to working-class men, then crucially to women, completely changed politics. You saw the rise of labor-focused parties, implementing welfare state policies, pensions, healthcare, unemployment support.
So democracy and the welfare state went hand in hand.
Absolutely. It was kind of an anthropological revolution, you could say. The state started escaping the exclusive grip of the old elites, thanks to universal suffrage, parliaments, an independent press, unions. It's still imperfect, obviously, but it was a huge shift.
What are the big lessons from that period?
Two key things, maybe. One, progress needs democratic roots. This helped delegitimize the top-down communist model, too. Two, it showed you can organize huge parts of society, education, health, transport, energy, outside of pure market logic, often more efficiently and equitably. Just compare European public health care to the U.S. private system.
In taxes, they must have played a big role.
Oh, enormous. The invention and spread of progressive income and inheritance taxes in the 20th century was revolutionary, especially the really high top marginal rates in the mid-century, sometimes over 90% in the US and UK.
Wow. Would that have happened without WWI and the Bolshevik threat?
That's a huge historical question. Maybe not. Those crises definitely shook the old order and created political space for radical changes like steeply progressive taxes.
And this period, from roughly 1914 to 1980, saw inequality fall significantly.
Yes, the Great Compression, as it's sometimes called, driven by progressive taxes, the welfare state, stronger unions. But since about 1980, that trend reversed. Effective tax rates on the very wealthy have fallen dramatically, sometimes becoming regressive, the rich paying a lower percentage than others.
And that's risky.
Hugely risky. It undermines the fairness of the system, erodes social solidarity. And interestingly, the evidence doesn't really support the idea that those high mid-century tax rates killed growth or innovation. Yeah, that period actually saw very strong economic growth in the US and elsewhere. The argument could be made that it was the battle for equality and investment in education that drove development, not worshiping inequality.
The post-WWII reconstruction in Europe, that also seems like a key moment for inequality.
It was. Europe came out of the war with crushing public debts. But instead of just buckling down to repay it over decades like Britain did after Napoleon,
What did they do?
many countries effectively reduced the debt burden through a mix of policies. Outright cancellation, letting inflation erode its value, and imposing special one-off taxes on large private fortunes. These were major political battles, but they were crucial for clearing the decks, funding reconstruction, and reducing inequality significantly.
So those progressive taxes weren't just about redistributing after the fact.
Exactly. They also served to limit pre-tax inequality, what some call pre-distribution. They acted as a check on extreme income concentration at the source and helped counterbalance the power of the purely commercial sector.
Looking forward, you mentioned property concentration is still a huge issue. The bottom half owns very little. What are some ideas to tackle that?
Right. Growth alone clearly hasn't diffused wealth widely. One radical idea discussed is some form of inheritance redistribution, basically, giving everyone a minimum capital endowment, maybe at age 25, funded by progressive taxes on large fortunes and inheritances.
A kind of starting capital for all.
Sort of. To give everyone a basic stake, and funding the welfare state and ecological transition could come from unified progressive taxes on income and carbon emissions. We also need to think beyond just private versus state ownership.
Like social ownership.
Yes, exploring diverse forms of collective resource management, or ideas like salarial socialism, maybe a salary for life tied to qualifications, expanding Social Security, or worker-managed investment funds gaining ownership stakes in firms. The historical trend is concentration, so reversing it needs bold thinking.
Financial globalization since the 80s.
Yeah.
How has that affected equality efforts?
Well, freeing up capital flows, while pushed by both right and left for different reasons initially, it's made things harder for states in some ways.
How so?
It's increased financial opacity, easier to hide money. It fuels tax competition as countries try to lure capital with lower rates. And it makes it harder for individual nations to control capital movements or tax wealth effectively. Tax havens thrive in this environment. Plus, international treaties often prioritize protecting property rights over allowing governments to pursue redistributive policies.
Let's talk about real equality beyond just laws.
Right.
Education, gender, origin.
Right, legal changes are crucial, but often not enough. Take education. Even with low tuition, kids from privileged backgrounds often have huge advantages from earlier training, social networks, cultural codes.
The playing field isn't level.
Not at all. Even in France, with its supposedly egalitarian system, disproportionate resources go to elite institutions benefiting the already privileged. Transparency helps, we need good data, but it has to be linked to policies that actively promote mixing and equity at all levels, like maybe centralized assignment procedures considering social background.
What about affirmative action?
It can be a necessary tool to counteract historical disadvantage, but it's complex. Needs careful design, democratic debate, evaluation to avoid backlash or unintended effects. And education alone isn't enough if societal prejudice is deep-rooted. Sometimes you might need other measures, like quotas in certain fields.
The history of discrimination against women is just immense.
It's and global. And sometimes, ironically, the rise of centralized states actually hardened patriarchy. Look at the Napoleonic Code. Winning the vote took generations of struggle.
And even after legal equality, culture lagged behind.
Hugely. The housewife ideal persisted for decades after WWII. Women's share of paid work and income remained low, despite often working longer hours if you include unpaid domestic labor. The gap has narrowed, but it's still significant.
Is there evidence that having more women in charge helps?
Yes, research shows positive impacts of women in leadership. And studies have even quantified unconscious bias, like how the perceived credibility of a speech changes based on the attributed gender of the speaker. Implementing gender parity, like in French politics or on corporate boards, has often been hesitant, requiring constitutional changes and ongoing pushes.
What about quotas based on social origin, like India's reservations? What can we learn?
India's system is vast, covering historically marginalized castes and tribes, a huge part of the population. It's constitutionally mandated and has opened doors in education and government jobs.
But has it reduced overall inequality?
Yeah. That's debated. While providing opportunities, some argue it lets elites off the hook from tackling deeper economic inequalities. Overall inequality in India actually rose after 1980, despite reservations. Contrast that with states like Kerala or West Bengal, where communist governments implemented land reforms, which seemed to have a bigger impact on reducing inequality there.
So quotas aren't a magic bullet.
No. Ideally, maybe quota systems evolve towards affirmative action based on broader socioeconomic factors, parental income, wealth, education, to avoid locking in group identities. And crucially, they shouldn't be an excuse to avoid universal policies that benefit all disadvantaged groups. Addressing negative discrimination against the poor and working class across the board is vital.
Measuring discrimination based on race or ethnicity is really fraught, isn't it?
It is. Using ethno-racial categories in censuses is controversial in many places, like France. But there are other ways to monitor objectively.
Like what?
Things like testing studies, sending identical CVs with different-sounding names to track response rates, analyzing police stop data for bias. A French study, for instance, clearly showed discrimination against applicants with Arab Muslim-sounding names. You probably need dedicated agencies to do this kind of monitoring systematically. And even supposedly neutral policies, like French secularism, can be hypocritical if they indirectly favor established religions through subsidies or tax breaks.
Okay, final stretch. Zooming out globally. Inequality between countries is still stark.
Extreme. The poorest half of humanity owns basically nothing in terms of net wealth,
Oh,
and the gap between average incomes in rich and poor countries has actually widened since 1980.
why? Weren't market reforms supposed to help?
The Washington Consensus, rapid trade liberalization, privatization often imposed on the global south, frequently failed. It often led to falling tax revenues, especially from customs duties, weakening states without providing alternatives or support. And often, financial flows actually go from poor to rich countries when you factor in profit repatriation by multinational corporations and capital flight facilitated by tax havens. Public aid flowing south is often dwarfed by wealth flowing north. Look at Eastern Europe within the EU. Huge profit outflows.
So what's needed globally?
Much greater fiscal transparency is key. A global financial register to track who owns what assets where would be a game changer against tax evasion. Longer term, maybe we need new forms of global governance, transnational democracy. Think transnational assemblies with real power to manage global public goods, ensure fiscal justice.
Like the European Parliament, but stronger.
Potentially, but overcoming the limitations of the current EU model where national governments hold vetoes on key issues like tax is the challenge. Maybe groups of countries could voluntarily create assemblies with real budget powers decided by a majority within agreed limits.
So you wrap up the source's perspective with this idea of a democratic, ecological, and multicultural socialism. What does that look like?
It's essentially arguing the battle for equality continues, fueled by past struggles. Environmental crises might be the next big driver of change, like the 1930s depression was, though reactions could turn ugly if inequality isn't addressed.
Right.
Transforming the global economic system towards sustainability and fairness is essential. Comparing emissions, China might reach Western living standards with lower peak emissions, but vested interests block climate action everywhere. Reducing public debt in the West by fairly taxing huge private fortunes could create fiscal space for change.
So democratic socialism isn't a return to the past.
No, it's presented as a continuation of those historical shifts towards social and economic justice. The argument is, if Western countries adopted this language, democratic socialism, ending neocolonialism, global fiscal justice, sharing tax data and revenues, they might regain credibility with the global south and offer a real alternative to, say, Chinese authoritarian state capitalism.
Because no system has all the answers now.
Exactly. Ecology, patriarchy, xenophobia, every system struggles. We need dialogue and learning between them. Even central banks, often seen as purely technocratic, could potentially play a more democratic role in promoting equality. The end goal is maybe a kind of universalist sovereignism, meaning political communities can set their own conditions for trade and investment based on universal principles of social, fiscal, environmental justice, even if it means breaking from past deals or needing majority decisions internationally, not unanimous ones that allow holdouts.
So to bring this deep dive to a close then, we've covered this long, often really uneven march towards greater equality since the 18th century. We've seen how stubborn the concentration of power and wealth can be, the deep legacies of colonialism and discrimination, and maybe some potential paths towards a more just future.
That's right. And the outcome isn't predetermined. It really depends on continued struggles, learning from history, and the willingness to actually challenge the structures that perpetuate inequality.
Which brings us to our final thought for you listening. Given this long, complex history, the pushes for equality, the massive resistance, what fundamental assumptions do you hold about what a truly equal society would even look like? And how might the historical realities we've discussed today challenge or maybe reinforce those assumptions as we face the inequalities of our own time? Becoming well-informed is definitely an ongoing journey, and we hope this deep dive gave you some fresh perspectives to mull over.